Hi there, I'm Deep Dhillon. Welcome to your AI Injection, the podcast where we discuss state-of-the-art techniques in artificial intelligence with a focus on how these capabilities are used to transform organizations, making them more efficient, impactful, and successful.
I think before we start, we should actually define what plagiarism is. So we're all on the same page, right? It's only plagiarism if you would represent that as your own expression or your own original work. If you say it and I guess if you don't attribute it to somebody, one could claim it as your own work. But as long as you say these thoughts are not my own or something at the end of your article, technically it wouldn't be plagiarism. Or this post has partially been generated by AI.
But how much of what we say or do, like let's rewind 30 years, 40 years ago, right? Every human thought they were pretty original back then. And we genuinely thought like, okay, like you go out, you read a bunch of books, you assimilate the information, whatever comes out of my mouth is mine. But in this world where 8 billion of us are like tightly coupled, can you even say that anymore? Can you even say that your own thoughts are that original? I mean, we all have a million experiences where the right people with the right background come up with the same ideas. It's like,
yeah, I was going to ask the same question.
Newton, they both came up with calculus.
I think of it just in terms of the creative aspect of our brains. We're influenced by people. You see in the music industry, people say, hey, you stole this riff by Led Zeppelin. It's like, well, how many different riffs are there in the world that are unique that also humans actually like?
And at what point are they unique? How different do they have to be unique, right? Because especially in music, like styles influence each other. Somebody makes a riff that sounds almost like Jimi Hendrix, but it's not quite Jimi Hendrix. And then he suddenly is a great guitar player, not a plagiarist, right? So what makes things unique? And to Deep's thought, I think the question should be, what is not plagiarism?
So what is not, I feel like is a little bit easier to answer. If I put together a series of sentences and I take them sort of sentence by sentence, and I can query the vast historical reservoir of the world across ideally every language. And I can not just query for the exact syntax or spelling or whatever, but also encompass the semantics. If I come back with nothing, then I feel like that's not plagiarism.
Oh, you had a bad search engine.
Well, that is kind of part of the problem, isn't it?
When you submit a paper to, certain peer-reviewed journal articles, there is a due diligence by some of them to see if you've actually plagiarized material. So it comes down to how good is your search engine, right? And I would say I feel pretty clean in thinking that I came up with a lot of original thoughts in the stuff that I've written in the past. But the reality is that I'm totally influenced by all of the history of other people's writings, the style that they use. Oh, I like the way that they phrase that. So is it plagiarism if I grab sort of the idea from someone, but maybe change the words around a little bit? To me, that's
technically, yes.
Where most profs universities are going to say, now you're in clear plagiarism territory.
So if I do that for a blog article, I don't feel bad, especially if I reference the thing, which I do. But when you do that for a technical article that's going in a peer-reviewed, it's supposed to be innovative and original and so forth, and there are much more scrutinists there. But the reality is, it's a fuzzy line, really.
I think there you also have to differentiate between like news outlets and people publishing news or writing articles, which is like, I think it's probably 80% plagiarism, right? Because there's an event happening somewhere. Reuters released a little statement of what really happened.
99.9% plagiarism. I mean,
100 newspapers pick it up and like rewrite it.
I know, and we accept that as what? I mean, we accept it as it is what it is. I mean, they don't even bother to reference. There's best case scenario, there was one reporter on the ground, right? Often there's zero reporters on the ground.
You say they don't even bother to reference. They don't even bother to write the truth, but that's a different story.
Well, that is a different story. But let's going back to let's get it to ChatGPT, because I think this is the crux of the matter is ChatGPT and other large language models are sucking down more info than any single human can in multiple lifetimes if they have them, and it's doing it in a way that is authentic in some sense. I would argue it's authentic in the sense that it's genuinely trying to, quote, read what it's seeing. And you could argue that, like, well, how different is that entity's sort of answering a question just based on what comes to mind in the same way that we would? I feel like putting some reference checking like after the fact maybe gets us to a place where we could live with it. But it seems like the very notion of individualized thought ownership is in question here.
Well, I love what you said not long when you started this conversation, like 30, 50, whatever years ago, everybody thought how they were so original. And these models, just to be absolutely clear, differ in one giant respect. They said, well, instead of building a model for the medical domain and for poets and all these different domains, they said, we're going to take all the data in the world in modern history, and we're going to use that text mode as a means of really capturing what it is to communicate as a human being to one another for all of the world, all of the planet. So you no longer have these like pockets of division where somebody's an expert in poetry or an expert. You're now really literally absorbing the world's worth of information going back however many decades, you see individual discipline. So this idea of plagiarism, or this idea of even these completions that are coming out of AI 21 or out of GPT-3 or out of all these large language models, they're just this giant consensus of text information in a way that's almost like plagiarism.
Well, it is, because so if you define plagiarism as representing something that is not your original work, then by definition, what GPT-3 does is plagiarize, because there is no thought there. There's no logic, there's no reasoning, there's no thinking about what it says. It basically just recombines facts in patterns that it has learned from what it has seen.
Yes.
And
how is that different from any one of us reading 50 different papers and books and then being asked to author something based solely on those 50 papers and books and saying it's not plagiarism? I mean, the main thing that comes to mind is like citation. Like we will actually cite when we get really close to a particular idea.
Well, we also logic and reason about what we have read. So there's like 50 books and like 30 state one thing, 10 state another, and another 10 state something else. Then as a human, you kind of like look at that and you try to combine it, and you might come to the conclusion they're all wrong. You might say they're all wrong because they can't agree. Or you might say, well, the majority thinks that, but I do think I have a feeling that this particular statement here makes more sense, and you might interpret that. GPT-3 will not do that. It will not it can't reason about things.
I don't know. I mean, it certainly looks like something reasoning about things. Everything you say about like stack ranking the frequency of occurrence of particular positions and stuff.
That's all statistics.
That's accounted for. Well, sure. No, yes, but humans are doing statistics when we do the same thing. I heard that 9 times. I give that a certain amount of weight. One of the 3 times that I heard something else happened to come from somebody way more important. I'm going through that process.
Humans also do philosophy. So go back to some old Greek philosophers that basically talk to you about making certain assumptions and then trying to reason about them. You can try that with GPT or with ChatGPT. It'll fail miserably. That level of reasoning does not exist.
I don't know. Like I've had some pretty involved conversations with it.
Yeah, but it doesn't believe. I literally tried
it that. It definitely reasons. Like in some
does
cases,
not. You can tell it simple things like assume a porcupine is blue and blue things can fly. Can a porcupine fly? It will not make that leap for you. It will not, give up on what its knowledge base knows. It will just insist that porcupines aren't blue.
And
so that's a very simple example.
I think we're also touching upon one of the advents of ChatGPT-3 or GPT versus older large language models. Deep and I just discussed this not long ago, where in the GPT-2, GPT-3 world, it was just very fun to play with. You could see how it did language translation, exceptionally well, for example. But what was missing in terms of like you believing everything that it spit out, you thought that, wow, that sounds very human-like. That was kind of the part that freaked you out. But then you would get answers to things like, what's larger, a pizza or the moon? And it would say, sometimes it would say like the pizza is. And we all know as human beings, when you're, I don't know what age, I knew maybe 4 years old, 5 years old, that's a physics issue. That's a perspective issue. You're simply looking at something right in front of your face versus something that's, tens of thousands of miles away from you. And so it doesn't have those patterns of like physics, or there's rules and physics and so forth. But even when you take things that are sort of like laws of physics and things, there's also these subjective materials, like saying that like Hitler was just this wonderful guy, things that people find objectionable. But what they've done now is they've introduced a layer of human sort of intervention on top of this, which is reinforcement learning, which allows humans to actually read these outputs from the old models and stack rank them to say, you know what, you gave me 20 answers for this, and it turns out that that's not the way most humans think and feel. So it's still not
There's
sentient.
definitely, yeah, I mean, it's
not
definitely
sentient, but it's this.
but it sounds
human. It sounds better.
Yeah, and just to push on Carsten, on your point about the lack of the ability to see the physical world. I mean, definitely rewind 6 months ago. Yeah, that was definitely the case. But with ChatGPT, if nothing else, it's creating a good illusion. Like, I had a really involved conversation with it about how long it would take to yell at a cup of tea to make it boil. This was up there with some pretty high quality grad school late night drunken conversations. and this thing was killing it, and it picked a position and it stood with it, and everything was saying, it's coming back to like a lot of different physics principles that we were touching on, and it was making a coherent like argument that lasted a while. I'll in the show notes we'll post that conversation. But I definitely get that. We know that there's a gap in like a physical understanding of the world and how these things are trained.
Or not even
illusion
physical,
of
but
it
a
is
metaphysical understanding, right? It doesn't deal with metaphysics. It doesn't deal with like, thought experiments or philosophical assumptions or things like that. There's no doubt that the thing is just an amazing feat of technology, and the conversations that are coming out are nothing short of really fascinating. But there's certain things that are missing, and the other big thing is that it often just makes shit up.
Well, let's take it back to plagiarism. So there's a few folks that are now making models to specifically detect ChatGPT, GPT-2, 3, whatever content. And so somebody took this and started taking some ChatGPT output and putting it into this model. So I sat down and I thought, okay, like, let's assume that if you're a professor and you got a bunch of essays coming in as of last Wednesday, I don't think you can assume the bulk of your people are not using this anymore. Like, I mean, I showed this to my daughter or friends. They all like were taking notes immediately. They were like, we are on this, man. And so you're going to go to the standard, anti-plagiarism tools that are looking for little references. So I did a couple of directions. Like, so one direction is I went to ChatGPT and I said, write me an essay about blah. I take this essay, stick it into this model, and it comes back 99.8% like GPT stuff. So I was like, okay, well, let's break it down a little bit. Let's start messing around with it. So then I start occasionally, because I had this theory like, I think there's a few things going on. One thing that I think is going on is people make mistakes when they actually write something. Like, they don't use exactly one space between a period and the start of the next sentence. So I threw in a couple of extra spaces, inspiration for whatever Elon Musk's scam was to figure out who was leaking information. I don't know if you guys followed that, but that was kind of
No,
funny.
I didn't.
Oh, yeah. So apparently I think it was Tesla, somebody was leaking information. And he had authored, some text. And I don't know if this is true or rumor.
Everybody got a different text.
Everyone got a different one with like a different encoding of white space between like words and sentences. And then they like figured out exactly who was setting up. Kind of a clever approach. So anyway, I did that, and then my 99.9% starts dropping pretty fast based on just white space inclusion. So
what did it go down to?
Like, if I changed a couple of white spaces, it was still in the high 90s, like 99s. But then when I started doing stuff like, I went the other direction too. I took some text that I had actually authored, put it in, and it said, not ChatGPT, not GPT. But it wasn't down at 0. It was like at 55% or something. So then I took a phrase like, we use terms on our website like AI consulting technology. So I took out the AI part so that it was less specific. It would jump up and be more, potentially viable. So I think there's like a bunch of things that the model inherently hones in on.
Making it less pristine, a little bit more human, a little bit more messy, tends to
and a little bit, and also making it more general. Need help with computer vision, natural language processing, automated content creation, conversational understanding, time series forecasting, customer behavior analytics? Reach out to us at Xyonix.com. That's Xyonix.com. Maybe we can help. But the larger question I would ask is, like, given just text, can you actually build a model to detect whether this thing is authored automatically or not? And what kinds of things would it hone in on?
The thing that you just mentioned are things like ChatGPT is not probably going to put out things with a ton of junk in them, given that there's this extra human layer that's been applied to it now. So when you do more human-like kind of stupid things with spaces and so forth.
I put slang in there. The slang dropped my plagiarism score way down.
Well, you know, these models
that's all
have
fake detections, right? I mean, at that point, you're just like detecting bad writers and not whether or not it's ChatGPT or not.
Yeah. I mean, and also, like, if you can get ChatGPT to sound like a bad writer too. And so then I was messing with that. I'm like, hey, sound like somebody with grammatically incorrect statements regularly, try to misspell some stuff and just seem like an ignorant buffoon and talk about blah. And I put that in, and yeah, the detection was a lot lower.
Yeah, it's like you're trying to, like, you just train the model to learn all the different writing styles, including abnormalities of the whole world. And now you're trying to figure out to reverse engineer that again and make it distinguish itself from that. I don't think it's possible. I think this thing can produce text in any style that is represented on the internet in significant amounts. And it learned that. And
I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, that was my takeaway too, was like, we can come up with something that will catch the lazy plagiarizers, but the motivated plagiarizers, I don't know that you're going to be able to catch them.
What we don't have here is, we know that these models take a prompt, which is like, you give it a few examples of the things, that the type of responses you're looking for, those few shot learners. And then it also has all these parameters that you set, how wild do you want the completion to be, etc. Not knowing the parameter sets behind what you're seeing out of ChatGPT, it makes it impossible to reverse. Theoretically, if you knew the settings behind the scenes, and some kid for a class wrote a paper, and the professor said, well, I'm going to take some of the things that he wrote and put them in as a prompt, see what GPT-3 generates, and I'll compare the two writings. And if they're super similar, I know that's a strong hint that you probably plagiarized the thing. But you don't know, right? You don't know those settings in general. So you can't possibly reverse engineer it.
I mean, you could conceivably take like a... Go ahead and finish your thought.
Well, there's this idea, I come from a nonlinear dynamics world, and it's like, it's the same thing. Like, you observe this output from this very complicated system. Can you reverse engineer it and find out the parameters of the model that governed those solutions and produce that output? This is the same thing. We see this output, and can we reverse engineer what are the parameters that went into this model that could actually generate the output that we see before us? Maybe it's in the style of writing, with Kerouac or whatever. It's very, very, very difficult to do that. I would say almost impossible.
Given chaos theory, I would say the answer is no.
Right. There's also that, right?
How would we, let's say that we want to build a plagiarism detector, right? And yes. and let's have the thought experiment. Like, from let's think about it first without reference text. So like, we can't just have a Google like index of everything actually said. But even that's suspect, because even that's going to have stuff that isn't real. But like, just what would we do, and how would we go about it? Even formulating the problem.
I would say without reference text, you wouldn't. It's impossible to detect plagiarism without reference text.
I would agree.
If you had a good search engine and you'd say, okay, we just assume that we define plagiarism as something that is replicated and also known to this particular corpus of this search engine, then you could simply search for it. I think that's honestly the only way to reliably detect plagiarism. And then you just have to figure out at which point of overlap you would define something as plagiarism. And even that is a difficult question, right? Is a single sentence enough? Does it have to be multiple sentences? Does it have to be the same context, right?
If I write an article, Carsten and Deep, and I submit it to a physics journal, 1 year later, I write another article in another physics journal, and I take a sentence from that article A, and I just change some words and put it into article B. Am I plagiarizing myself?
If you don't quote yourself properly,
question, right?
If you don't quote yourself properly, you do. Yes.
Let's say I do. Let's say I do reference. myself.
Then you're fine, and it's not plagiarism.
So the
No,
safe
it's
thing
true,
to do
right?
is just.
I agree with you. It's a little, I just think it becomes super fuzzy with these LLMs. I mean, it's almost like a moral thing.
But the question to
like-
me is also, I'm digressing from Deep's detector question, but the question also, does it really matter?
Does what matter?
Whether or not something is plagiarism or not, if it was generated in this shape or form. I mean, so academia,
Yeah.
but if you go and you publish something as a new document or a new research paper in academia, they already do check if it's plagiarism or if you didn't quote something, it will probably come out, right? And we stated earlier that if you're in the news article sphere,
Nobody cares. They just
nobody
plagiarize
cares
left,
in the
right, and
first
center.
place.
It's
And-
entertainment.
And
it's
social
not news.
media and blog posts, people care even less.
Sure.
Yeah.
So is plagiarism a big issue? Do we really think people will use this here to
Well, I mean, I
write,
think
let's
it's
say,
it's a
academic
big
papers?
issue wherever you want to attribute individual thought. Like if you want to give somebody credit as a creator of this truly individual thought, which school is probably the most obvious place where they care about that. Company settings, I think people care about it a lot less. People generally, I don't know, my take is like people just don't want to get caught for plagiarism.
Right,
It's not that
right.
they ethically, it's one of those things that's hard to define. You know, like we all know that if you just grab somebody's essay and put your name on it and turn it in,
That's bad.
that's bad. Everyone can agree on that. But then on the other end of the spectrum,
Wait, hold up for that thought a second. That's only bad because you claim to have done work that you actually didn't do and are rewarded for it. So I think plagiarism, it's not just the fact you replicated something, but it's kind of like the fact that you misrepresented your effort into it and get rewarded for it. So I think it's linked to that reward system. So in other words, if you make a career by plagiarizing people, that's bad. If you plagiarize things just to spread content, who cares? You're not, if you don't really get rewarded by it, I guess that's what most people do when they try to search optimize their website, right? So yeah.
So, but like, let's take the same
There you go.
scenario, but instead of just putting my name on it, like, and let's shrink it down. Let's say it's a paragraph of text. This student grabs it, puts it in there, and then they take every single sentence. And I'm just trying to like create the spectrum here. So now instead of just putting their name on it, they take every single sentence and they just do some basic synonym swapping, some basic like grammatical rearrangements, general sequences of sentences is the same. I think we're all still going to basically say that's still plagiarism. We're going to get it on that spectrum.
Well, you get a couple of points for actually like changing the sentences, right?
Sure,
So,
right? Like it's like all of us took, CS 101 and there was always that kid that grabbed somebody's code and just changed all the variable names and stuff and
well, so actually in coding, it's good practice because you're taking a piece of validated code, right?
Sure.
Well, here, I think
That's right.
we're touching on something that's super important here. And, a negative view of this is like, kids today are going to abuse this. They're not going to learn anything. But if you think about it positively, it's like, well, now this kid that maybe is not that great of a writer can be influenced by the world in different styles of writing, can actually learn how to write things correctly, the structure, the form, how you build a story.
Well, yeah, hang on to that. I think that's super important because I want to finish my sequence, my thought sequence. So now we're still in agreement that it's generally plagiarism. But now if let's go up one level. So now the student took that paragraph. They didn't just semantically like swap out words for synonyms and do some grammatical rearrangements. Now they just kind of took the general idea of each sentence. They went out, maybe they did some searching, they came up with some original ideas, and they're like, I'm gonna kind of delete this one, I'm gonna like rewrite this here, I'm gonna do this one. And then maybe like one or two sentences are sort of in the semantic ballpark of the original, but this thing looks quite different and they've assimilated a lot of different sources. Plagiarism, is that enough to throw a kid out of college for at that point?
Well, he's certainly pushing away from what we might consider to be a slam dunk.
Right. So what are we down to?
Effort,
are we down to those
thought.
two sentences that are still semantically quite similar? Is that what we're down to in terms of like throwing them out of school?
I think plagiarism goes back down to the amount of original thought that you put into your work. And I can't tell you where the threshold is at which point you have put enough original thought into your modification of somebody else's work that it becomes a valid piece of your own. And I think the same thing is true not just for text, but also for art, right? At what point does plagiarism become art? if you take an image or a painting that you like, but you don't really like certain aspects of it, and you think, well, I can do better, but I really love that scene. Do you redo it? Is that plagiarism? Right?
Yeah, I mean, it's like when rappers started, lifting like rhythms and riffs, and like the Beastie Boys, like Paul's Boutique comes to mind. They had like, I mean, all kinds of stuff totally yanked out of context, put in a song, and then just like popped all over the place.
Well,
Everybody clearly said that's
yeah.
an original sound, that's original thought. But
but they presented it to an audience who have never heard that material before.
Yeah.
So this new audience of younger people who are into this are like, oh, that's really cool, blah blah blah. And then you hear and you're like, dude, that was totally ripped off. That was like.
So I think here's the point. Here's the kicker, right? Like they just made their album, and like a lot of hip hop and rap artists just sampled. And I think this started in like late 80s or something. And then they just left it to the studio, to the record label to go figure out who to pay and who to compensate and like how to like do it. And I think that's the key here, is that maybe this analogy makes sense here. Like the rappers basically just boom, artistic, complete and like liberal. They just go to town, put their stuff together, and maybe they wind up with 7 words from this artist and like 1/10 of a second from that artist. And now someone else chases it down, figures out who got lifted, how to give credit, how to write checks, how much should the checks be. I think that's how it worked out. I don't know, like some music expert can tell us, but maybe that's what we need here, is you just lift and you just do your thing, and then something else figures out how to attribute.
And it brings us back a little bit to the definition of plagiarism, where they basically say that it's the representation of another person's language, thoughts, ideas, or expressions as your original work. As long as you give that attribution to it, and you correctly say, this is a song originally by so-and-so, I'm redoing it, this is a cover, this is a rendition, it's no longer plagiarism, because you gave this original credit, and you leave it up to the audience or the consumer to decide which version they like better.
So in the case of an automated tool, like a reference maker, if you will, you go to ChatGPT. So in our new arena here, what we're saying is you go to ChatGPT and the new tools, and you get whatever the heck you want. You do whatever the heck you need to. You go out and just write your thing, and you're just gonna rely on the quality of the tools to find references for you.
Well, you don't even need the references. You just need to say that it's not your original work.
I know, but like, isn't that exactly what the professor's asking you in college?
Oh no,
your original work.
That is a problem. So in an academic scenario where you have students using it to do their work, no, that's literally plagiarism. If it's not their work and they turn it in, no matter who generated it, it's plagiarism by definition, right? If you didn't do it yourself, it's that's how it's defined. You are delivering something, you claim it's your original work, but it wasn't. You typing the prompt into ChatGPT, does that make it your original work? I don't think so.
Well, what if you don't put in 1 prompt? What if you're putting in 50 prompts and you're going
still not your original word?
But why is it not a legitimate seed from which you can like diverge?
That's a good question. I don't really have an answer to it. How different is it from you sitting in front of Google for 3 days and, typing the same queries in Google, getting documents back and taking excerpts of them, rephrasing them, and then putting them into your essay? That, in my opinion, is also exactly the same thing that ChatGPT does in a way, right? So you could do that labor manually. You could go to Google, execute all your queries on Google, read like 300 documents, then write an essay on Abraham Lincoln, or you can ask ChatGPT the same question. From an educational point of view, I would say if you did that with Google, you learned a lot more than what you put into your essay. So it was a more beneficial effort for the student. And in the end, work is rewarded, right? Not just the end output, at least in a school scenario.
I don't know if you learn more,
if you ask me a specific question about Abraham Lincoln and I have to read through 30 different articles about him, I learned so much about Abraham Lincoln that is not about the subject or the aspect of him that I'm currently writing about, that I really expanded my horizon after I go through all that content.
But let's talk about the flip. The flip is you used ChatGPT and you got a lot of like high stack thought that you were able to navigate because ChatGPT did the reading for you on the originals, but you were able to dive so much deeper
into that one aspect.
Into the one aspect.
Yeah. So it's a more concentrated thing. It's a more concentrated thing. You wouldn't have expanded your horizon. You just went deeper on one particular little subject.
I mean,
but
the analogy feels to me like, imagine I'm like insanely wealthy and I'm a student and I have access to people that I can assign to go do readings for me. So I go and I have to write an essay on, to use your example, Abraham Lincoln and whatever. I say, okay, you read these 30 articles, you read those 20 articles, and then we sit in a room, we just talk. I got all that information assimilated, and I put together some original thinking that I call original. It's up for debate whether it really is, because now
ChatGPT-3 in this context provides a very polarized, filtered view of the thing you're ultimately seeking to write. And it takes away all of the 50 articles that you search through Google. You will learn a lot more than you actually need to write on a very specific topic. And ChatGPT-3 provides a framework for you in this case on how to go about writing. But I think ultimately it's going to provide inspiration to people that are not very good writers, but can't really find structure. And I think if they were just to use whatever was spat out by ChatGPT-3 as their own work, that is definitely plagiarism. But if they use it as inspiration to go off on a particular paragraph and do more investigation, write it in their own voice, change it in a way where they essentially feel that is their own thoughts on the subject, then now we're getting away from something that's plagiarized.
I think it's almost a different topic from plagiarism itself, the potential threat this poses to the educational system and assignments, yes. Right? Because whether or not it's plagiarism or not, you also have to ask yourself, what is the intent of giving a student that job to write that essay? Is it really the end result or the process? And it's about the process and learning how to write an essay and formulating coherent sentences and things like that. I honestly don't think, though, that ChatGPT is a problem there. It has changed the landscape. There will be way less like homework essay writing assignments because you cannot prevent your students from cheating. So I think the solution to that problem is just like, don't do it anymore. Don't have them make things they can do things that can solve with ChatGPT.
Like, let's say we're all, I don't know, literature or philosophy or whatever professors, and we're coming up with homework assignments, and they are at home, not in class. What can we do to encourage all of that original thought, that exploration, that research, fully let them use ChatGPT? Either we just accept that they're going to do it anyway, or we embrace it. That's my attitude. Like, what kinds of assignments can you give?
You can take a class. You can take a classroom if you're teaching some sort of English writing, maybe it's an English writing assignment. You can have people write in class on the spot and submit their papers. You know that they haven't had access to ChatGPT-3 there. They're writing their material, and then they have maybe some sort of review, some peer review. It's almost like when you're learning.
But I'm talking about the homework content. Like, there's a difference between a 1 hour in-class thought process and somebody going out and writing a 9-page paper on something.
It's the same thing that happens in math, right? You teach them the basics, the components that they can use to do the work by themselves, and you test them on those things. And then later on in life, you say, by the way, you'll probably just use a calculator or a computer to do what you just learned. And because no one in the world sits down and does things as we've just done. Everybody in the world.
And nobody's differentiating or.
So to a certain degree, you teach them the art of actually creating something and the structure in which they were going to create that thing, and whether they've done so, quote, correctly or not. But then when they get out in the real world, everybody does things as efficiently as possible. And ChatGPT-3 and you can argue any aspect of technology makes us inherently a bit lazy and a bit less creative, because ultimately a lot of the technology we create just makes our lives a lot easier and simpler.
I mean, I would be inclined.
Like, no one uses the abacus anymore.
I would be inclined to do the opposite. Like, I would be inclined to say, use ChatGPT, use it, and I would be inclined to take really like things that I know are ambitious and difficult to do with just ChatGPT. Like, I want you to write like a 20-page paper, but I want you to take this specific idea from the 14th century, blah, blah, and that specific idea from this other worldview. And because I know that these things are good generalized learners, and they can help you. You can take it up a level away from instances to generalized concepts, and you'll get some benefit. But I would just tell them blatantly use it.
that's the same thing that actually happens in math education. When you first start off, you're not allowed to use a calculator, right? You're learning the basics, you're learning the principles. You can't use a calculator in class. Later on in my graduate studies, use whatever you want. Use a calculator, use a computer, you can do whatever you want. You just need to solve the problem, right? So it's kind of like this slope of giving them more and more freedom to solve the problem at hand, but you adjust the difficulty of the problem to the tools at hand. And that's exactly what you just said.
No, I think that's exactly what you do, right? Like, I mean, I hated getting open book take-home exams. They were the worst. Like in grads, I know that 6 days of my life are totally and completely gone. Like, please just give me a 1 hour in-class exam. Like, I do not want to do this. And I know that I'm going to be like up till like 4 or 5 in the morning because these things are hard. And, and I don't know, back then there wasn't like everything sitting on the internet where you go Google that particular professor's exam from whatever. I feel like the educational establishment needs to really embrace these capabilities and be clever and figure out how to get their students to leverage it. Because in the real world, like, we want you to use all tools that are available, including ones that help you with high stack strategic thinking. I mean, I firmly believe, like, if you get exposed to something that's this smart, it's like having 50 grad students to ask questions to. Like, how is that not going to ultimately raise the bar with you?
I tend to think positively like that. I think that this is not going to be a tool. Certainly it's going to be used as a tool for certain people to flat out plagiarize things. But frankly, I think if you're that type of person, that's probably going to be that way no matter what. If you're the type of person who's actually interested in learning and interested in bettering yourself, you will use this as a tool for inspiration. You'll be standing on the shoulder of giants, just as those people before you stood on the shoulders of giants, just as those people before you stood on the shoulders of giants, and so forth. Technology always makes our lives easier, but your inspiration to actually learn a subject and better yourself will continue to improve. This just raises the bar for teachers in a way that takes something that's already a very subjective experience and really puts the onus on them to be able to say, I can't tell whether this kid actually did this on his own or not.
Think a little bit about, if you really want to test it, you could still do these homework assignments. You can let them use whatever tools they want to write them. And then when they turn them in, you make it a little bit like a thesis defense.
Yes,
in other words,
I love that idea.
You read this thing and you ask them particular questions about certain paragraphs that they wrote. And then you ask them why they claimed that and what else they can tell you about it. And that comes back with a blank, then...
That's beautiful, because at that point, even if ChatGPT wrote everything and they wrote nothing, but they can defend it.
If they know the subject matter and they have done the research, but it gets difficult. That only tests them about the content of what they wrote, not how they wrote it. So if you're an English literature professor or something, it becomes still difficult, because there it is all about the way that you write something and not so much about what you write. And,
I disagree.
Well, in a way, I mean, come on.
Let me ask you something else though. Are we, I'm going to tell you, like, so I have my son, when he was maybe 6th grade, 7th grade, he's a bit of a perfectionist. He would be tasked with writing an essay or, a paper or something. He would spend a lot of energy, like, Googling stuff, figuring out like what his general space is. And then he would feel this burden of novelty. Like he really wanted to write something that was unique, but he's looking at the world, and it would be really hard for him to find some novel approach. Then he would go write his paper, and then he would find out at the last minute that somebody else had already disproved his position or something, and then he would just delete it and turn in nothing. And I feel like we're taking humanity and we're sort of asking everyone to be unique, and it feels like we're creating this massive burden of novelty. Like, not everyone is like in a graduate program where the de facto position is to find something incredibly narrow that no one else has ever done before. We're losing something in that process where you genuinely have to come up with something novel now as a 7th grader. I mean, seems...
No, I don't think you should have to. I think you're right there. I think that shouldn't be the case, because it's almost close to impossible. And just to come back to what I said in the beginning, what is not plagiarism, right? I think I agree with you. I do not think that we are incredibly unique. I think there's, at any given point in time, probably 2 humans that have the same thought. It's difficult to say.
I think with the age of the internet, we kind of soon figured out, actually, we're not as unique as you might think you are. We tend to actually be much more alike than we are different. And it's a bit sad, a bit of an ego punch to a lot of people, thinking that they're really special sauce, but they're actually one of many people who had those same original thoughts.
Been
And
a-
there's another thing too that I think is important. It's not difficult to be novel as much as it is to be novel and write something of quality value, right?
substance, let's call it like impact.
Of substance, right? Math has its own sort of unique set of rules where things tend to be a little bit more black and white than something more subjective as go and write me an essay on a particular topic.
I think this has been a fun conversation on AI and plagiarism. I'm going to end it with like one final question. Let's fast forward 10 years. Let's go 10 years out. And with all of what all of us know about where these models, like I don't think any of us know where exactly they're going to be in 10 years, but we've seen this trajectory. That's incredible. Are we still in 10 years going to be talking about AI and plagiarism? Or are we in a totally different place? And like, how's the world different from a plagiarism advantage?
I'd like to take a stab at that because where we're going right now is we're talking about one modality of communication, which is text, but these models are now going to absorb audio. We've seen in a different product called Dolly where they can create images based on text, but we're going to be going the way of video too, where video is actually input. So I'm going to have your wife shoot us walking down the road. You're going to be playing the banjo. I'll be riding a pony. We'll put it in black and white and we'll make a little short video and then we'll feed that into one of these models and we're going to say, hey, given what you see before you, write a short story that explains this video. Or it will be the case, I think probably before we die, that we say, write me and create a movie for me of Carsten and I going to Europe together and, blah, blah, blah. And an actual video will be created of two characters, Carsten and Bill, going down the street. We are absolutely headed to these different modalities of communication, video, audio, and text. Now we're really talking about this world of plagiarism. It's going to be very, very fuzzy, even more so in that world. But we're definitely headed there.
So I actually don't think that plagiarism is a big problem, nor that it matters that much in the grand scheme of things. Like I said, it's just a measure to determine whether or not you should be rewarded for your work. I think what is more important is whether or not that work that you have done or that you're presenting there resembles the truth or not. And I think the big problem we will see with this is we won't know what content we can trust. And I think that goes from blog posts or blog articles. I mean, we have that problem already, right? It's well established in our new fake news.
We had an
world
insurrection at the Capitol, literally, because of misinformation.
But what worries me more are the things that are generally accepted as like evidence of wrongdoing today, right? If somebody captures a security camera video of you beating up that school kid in front of your house, you might go to jail, right? If I can 100% fake that, what kind of evidence can we still trust in that new world? And so the job of telling fakes from real evidence is going to become a lot more difficult, if not impossible. And that worries me a little bit.
And the reality is those tools that you speak of are being used by people who are not experts in artificial intelligence or data science. They're law enforcement officers, for example, who aren't experts in that field, and they're using this as a valid tool. Well, the tool is telling me that you were the guy that stole this.
Well, not law enforcement, but just plain out criminals. Like some guy, I might just say, hey, I saw Bill yesterday kick that cat in front of my door.
Yeah.
And sue you for it. And then I go.
I mean, I think like, yeah. Well, I'm going to try to take a stab at it. I think these are all awesome points. My take on it is humans are pretty smart.
I disagree.
Bear with me for a moment. Because I think we can really have that debate.
I don't understand.
But like if you rewind like a couple hundred, like 150 years ago, right? Somebody invents the photograph, the ability to shoot photographs, but it was a painful process. Like you had these little boxes and you had chemicals and darkrooms and all stuff. And then we had like 70, 80 years of, maybe 100 or so years of photographers, and it was an art. And people, were capturing things in certain ways and moments, and not to diminish photography, because I think there's still, photographers doing some unique work. But now we're in a world where, everybody's got a camera, everybody's got access to like amazing editing capabilities. Everybody's got Instagram and all this stuff. And we're just saturated in high quality imagery. We don't really care much about photographs anymore. We don't even think about the character of the photograph. We think about the moment, that it reveals something about your holiday or like what you were thinking or something else, but we're on a different level. And I think that's what's going to happen here is like, we've got these tools that are going to produce incredibly high quality things, but our bar is going to go up and what we focus on is going to change. Like, we're not going to be satisfied with somebody charging me $15 to go to a movie theater to see a film that somebody yanked out of a 15 seconds of effort and a great prompt with a killer robot. Like, we're going to want, because we love stories about humans. I don't know that we love stories about particular robots, even if they have personalities, maybe not. But I think we love stories about humans. And if we know that somebody, did this and that, and like had this journey, and there's like this whole thing, and then somehow they produced this thing that a bot maybe had a role in, but didn't, couldn't claim ownership over it. I think we will naturally migrate to those other areas that are like linked with human stories that we can bond with. That's my take. All right, guys, thanks a ton. This was a great conversation. That's all for this episode. I'm Deep Dhillon, your host, saying check back soon for your next AI injection. In the meantime, if you need help injecting AI into your business, reach out to us at Xyonics.com. That's Xyonix.com. Whether it's text, audio, video, or other business data, we help all kinds of organizations like yours automatically find and operationalize transformative insights.